1897. New Orleans was a city feared across America, a place where decadence met a violent reality in the humid Louisiana heat. Today, we step back into its most dangerous year. The port was the city's heart, bringing in wealth from across the globe, but also the desperate and the lawless who thrived in the shadows of the docks. The Third District was the epicenter of notoriety. Here, the police were scarce, and a code of silence protected the gangs that ruled the alleyways. Corruption reached the highest halls of power. Graft and bribery weren't just common, they were the oil that kept the city's gears turning amidst the chaos. In 1897, Storyville was born, a concentrated world of vice and violence that became the most infamous red light district in American history. For the average citizen, every walk down a streetcar line was a lesson in vigilance. Survival required knowing which shadows to avoid. But even in the darkness, a new sound was rising. From these dangerous streets, the defiant roots of jazz began to take hold, a heartbeat that couldn't be silenced. New Orleans in 1897 was a crucible of American culture, forged in the grit of survival. Welcome back to 1897 New Orleans. In Part 1, we walked the dangerous streets and saw the city's corruption. Now, in Part 2, we peel back the layers to reveal the specific crimes and the shadowy figures that made this city the murder capital of the South. From the rise of the Black Hand to the tragic lynchings that stained the city's soul, this is the story of blood and power. By 1897, the Italian Mafia was not just a rumor, it was a growing force. The city was still reeling from the assassination of Police Chief Hennessy years prior and the subsequent lynching of Italian immigrants. But instead of disappearing, the underworld organized. The Black Hand extortion letters began to appear on the doorsteps of businesses, demanding protection money or promising swift, violent retribution. The tactics were brutal and effective. A letter, signed with a crude drawing of a hand or a skull, would arrive. Ignore it, and your shop might burn. Defy them, and you might disappear into the swamps. In 1897, these networks were solidifying their control over the French Quarter's produce markets and shipping lines, creating a state within a state where the police had no jurisdiction. The police response was often pathetic. Officers were ill-equipped to deal with organized crime that spoke a different language and operated by a code of silence, omerta. In 1897, arrests were made, but convictions were rare. Witnesses would vanish, or memories would fail on the stand. The law enforcement of New Orleans was fighting a war it didn't understand, against an enemy it couldn't see. But the Mafia wasn't the only threat. Homegrown street gangs like the Shot Tower Gang and the Spiders terrorized their own neighborhoods. These weren't organized syndicates, they were packs of wolves. They fought over turf, over politics, and often just for the sake of violence. Election days in 1897 were particularly bloody, as these gangs were hired by politicians to intimidate voters and stuff ballot boxes. Meanwhile, in Storyville, a different kind of economy was booming. This wasn't just about vice, it was big business. The Blue Book guides listed the houses and the women like menu items. 1897 was the year this system became formalized. Behind the velvet curtains and the jazz piano, women navigated a dangerous path between exploitation and empowerment, often holding the secrets of the city's most powerful men. We often overlook the women in this history, but figures like Josie Arlington were rising to power. They ran empires of their own, navigating a world dominated by violent men. In 1897, a woman who could survive in Storyville was a force to be reckoned with. They carried derringers in their purses and knew exactly who to bribe to keep their doors open. The violence of 1897 was also racial. The shadow of Plessy versus Ferguson, decided just a year prior, loomed large. Segregation was hardening into law, and racial violence was common. The separate but equal doctrine was a lie that fueled anger and despair. In the poorer districts, black and white residents often lived side by side in poverty, but the legal system was weaponized to keep them divided and oppressed. Spirituality also played a role in the city's mystique. The legacy of Marie Laveau was still potent. In 1897, voodoo was practiced in secret courtyards, a spiritual resistance against the hardships of life. It was feared by the white establishment, but revered by those who sought protection from the law and the violence of the streets. The line between faith and superstition was thin and often crossed. As if the violence wasn't enough, 1897 brought a resurgence of yellow fever. The city was paralyzed. Trains were stopped, mail was fumigated, and shotgun quarantines were enforced by armed guards. The fear of contagion turned neighbor against neighbor. It was a biblical plague descending on a city that many preachers claimed was being punished for its sins. The cemeteries filled up faster than the graves could be dug. The cities of the dead with their above-ground tombs became the only quiet places in New Orleans. In 1897, death was so common that the funeral processions became a daily parade, blending with the brass bands to create that unique New Orleans tradition of celebrating life in the face of death. The newspapers fueled the fire. The Picayune and the Item printed lurid details of every crime, turning murderers into celebrities. In 1897, the media created a narrative of a city under siege, which, while true, also served to sell papers. This sensationalism contributed to the national reputation of New Orleans as a place where life was cheap and the stories were always bloody. As 1897 came to a close, New Orleans was a city exhausted. It had survived gang wars, epidemics, and political scandals. It was a city scarred but standing. The events of this single year laid the foundation for the complex, vibrant, and sometimes dangerous city we know today. It was a year that tested the soul of the Crescent City. Thank you for joining me on this journey through 1897. We've seen the darkness, but also the resilience. New Orleans remains a city of stories, and these were some of its most intense. As 1897 drew to a close, New Orleans stood at a crossroads. The city had been tested by violence, disease, and corruption, but a new century was on the horizon. In this final part of our reconstruction, we look at the aftermath of the city's most dangerous year and the enduring legacy that would transform the Crescent City forever. This is the dawn of a new era. The yellow fever epidemic of 1897 was a wake-up call. The city realized that it could no longer survive in its own filth. A massive public health revolution began with the construction of the world's most advanced drainage and sewerage systems. This wasn't just engineering. It was a battle for the city's survival. The swamps were being drained, and with them, some of the shadows where crime had once hidden were brought into the light. Storyville was entering its golden age. What began as an experiment in containment had become a world-renowned destination. The district was now a city within a city, generating millions in revenue. But this prosperity was built on a fragile foundation of vice and exploitation. The blue books were becoming thicker, and the legends of the madams and the musicians were becoming part of the city's permanent folklore. Amidst the smoke and the shadows of Storyville, the music was evolving. The rough-edged sounds of 1897 were refining into what the world would soon know as jazz. Buddy Bolden, the legendary cornetist, was beginning to dominate the scene. This music was the ultimate expression of the New Orleans spirit, born in the streets, refined in the brothels, and destined to conquer the world. It was the sound of freedom in a city that was still deeply divided. But the old tensions remained. The turn of the century would see the Robert Charles riots, a violent explosion of racial anger that showed just how deep the wounds of 1897 still ran. The city was modernizing its infrastructure, but its social fabric was still fraying at the edges. The struggle for civil rights and human dignity would continue to be the real battlefront of New Orleans for decades to come. The port was also transforming. The grit of the 1897 docks was being replaced by modern industrial efficiency. New Orleans was reasserting its position as a global hub of trade. This economic boom brought a new wave of immigrants and a new sense of possibility. The dangerous city was becoming a productive city, but the memory of its lawless years remained a part of its character. The mafia, too, was changing. The Black Hand tactics of 1897 were evolving into more sophisticated forms of organized crime. The underground societies were becoming more integrated into the city's political and economic structures. The violence was becoming less random, but no less deadly. The foundations laid in the shadows of 1897 would support a criminal empire that would last for the next century. The people who survived 1897 were a special breed. They had lived through a year of biblical plagues and man-made violence. Their stories, passed down through generations, are what give New Orleans its unique depth. They knew that beauty and danger were two sides of the same coin. Their resilience is the true legacy of the dangerous city, a spirit of survival that defines the Crescent City to this day. As we look at the New Orleans of today, we see the echoes of 1897 everywhere, in the music, in the architecture, and in the indomitable spirit of its people. The city that was once the most dangerous in America has become one of its most cherished. But it's important to remember where it came from, to remember the grit, the blood, and the survival that made this city what it is. Our journey through 1897 New Orleans comes to an end. We've seen the worst of humanity and the best of its creative spirit. Thank you for joining me for this AI reconstruction of history. I hope these stories stay with you, just as the history of New Orleans stays with everyone who walks its streets.